It was a warm June evening in St. Mary Mead, the sort that lingered lazily between sunlight and shadow. The scent of elder flower drifted through the open windows of the vicarage, mingling with the chatter of the small gathering assembled in honor of Inspector Harrington's retirement. For 30 years he had been the quiet guardian of their village peace, a man with thinning hair, a fondness for marmalade, and a manner that suggested calm even in the midst of calamity. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, had insisted on hosting the farewell tea. "After all," she declared, "it's not every day a man retires with his conscience as spotless as his record." Those words had been met with polite smiles, though one or two guests had raised their brows ever so slightly. Miss Jane Marple, seated near the window with her embroidery, noticed that reaction at once. She always did. To her, the smallest twitch of a lip or the faintest tightening of a hand spoke volumes more than speeches. She smiled quietly to herself, threading her needle through the pale cotton cloth. In her experience, spotless records were rarely so spotless when viewed under the right light. Across the room, Inspector Harrington stood by the tea-table, regaling the vicar with tales from his early days in the force. Amusing little anecdotes about lost umbrellas, missing jewels found in teapots, and the peculiar behavior of cats during burglaries. The laughter flowed easily, though now and again a wistfulness entered his tone, as if he were already looking back from some great distance. Miss Marple's blue eyes, sharp despite their kindly appearance, flicked toward him with interest. There was something in the way he kept glancing toward the clock on the mantel, as though waiting for something. Or someone. "Expecting someone, perhaps," she murmured aloud, her tone mild and conversational. "Beg your pardon, Miss Marple." Mrs. Clement looked up from the sandwiches. "Oh, I was only observing that dear Inspector Harrington keeps such an anxious eye on the hour. I wonder if he's worried the kettle's gone off again," Miss Marple replied with her characteristic innocence. The room laughed, and the comment passed as another of her harmless little remarks. But the observation had been made. A moment later the door opened, and a tall, elegant woman entered. Her dark green hat was a little too fine for village farewells, and her perfume drifted ahead of her like a small announcement. "Ah," Harrington said, the warmth in his voice noticeably deeper. "You came, Margaret." "Of course," she said, with a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "How could I miss your last day?" A murmur ran through the guests. Mrs. Clement, ever discreet, busied herself with the tea service. Miss Marple's needle paused in mid-air. "Margaret Denham," she recalled suddenly. "A widow these past 10 years, lived 2 cottages over from the post office. Known for her quiet dignity, and for her sudden friendship with the inspector not long after her husband's death. A friendship that had, as the saying went, given the village something to talk about. The evening wore on with pleasant formality. There were toasts, laughter, and polite applause. Inspector Harrington made a brief speech about duty and community, his voice steady until the final line. "I can only hope I've left this village a little safer than I found it." It was met with warm clapping, but Miss Marple noted that Mrs. Denham's hands never touched. She merely smiled, watching him with that same detached composure, the smile of a woman thinking of something else entirely. As dusk gathered, the guests began to leave in 2s and 3s. Miss Marple lingered by the garden gate, exchanging a few pleasant words with Mrs. Clement about the roses. From the corner of her eye, she saw Harrington and Mrs. Denham standing beneath the lilac bush. His hand moved slightly as though passing her something small, metallic perhaps, before he stepped back and looked around quickly. When he noticed Miss Marple watching, he smiled and tipped his hat. "Good night, Miss Marple. Always a pleasure to see you," he called cheerfully. "Good night, Inspector," she replied, returning his smile. "And congratulations again on your well-earned rest. Though something tells me," she added softly, "you'll find it rather hard to stay idle." He chuckled, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something. Hesitation. Guilt. Miss Marple couldn't quite say. She only knew that it was rarely the guilty who looked so troubled by good wishes. By morning, the village was buzzing. The news spread first from Mrs. Finch, who'd seen the constable's bicycle by the Denham cottage at dawn, and then from Mr. Weaver at the grocer's, who'd heard that Inspector Harrington had never returned home after the party. By the time Miss Marple's housekeeper brought in the Morning Post, everyone in St. Mary Mead knew Inspector Harrington was dead, found early that morning in the meadow beyond the churchyard, lying on his back beneath the oak trees. His hat beside him, his pocket watch stopped at 11:42. The village had seen many things over the years, thefts, quarrels, even a poisoning or two, but never the death of a man like Harrington. And so, as the constables moved about with solemn faces and the villagers whispered from behind lace curtains, Miss Marple set down her cup of tea, adjusted her spectacles, and murmured to herself, "Well, well, the inspector's final case, indeed." By mid-morning, St. Mary Mead had ceased to breathe. Curtains were drawn only halfway, allowing slivers of pale light to touch the neat hedgerows and flower beds that had, until yesterday, seemed the very picture of peace. Now, every garden gate was ajar, every doorstep host to quiet conversation. The milk delivery went uncollected outside Mrs. Jeffreys's house. She was far, too occupied telling Mrs. Price Ridley what she'd heard about the inspector's watch being stopped at precisely 11:42. Miss Marple heard the talk, of course, though she preferred her own quiet observations to the chatter of speculation. She had gone for her morning walk as she always did, the same narrow lane lined with honeysuckle and whispering leaves. Yet today, she paused more often, her gaze wandering to footprints on the verge where the grass was pressed flat, the faint sign of a bicycle tire. Nothing extraordinary, she told herself, except that this lane led directly from the vicarage to the meadow where the inspector had been found. When she returned, she found Constable Rogers already at her gate. He was a young man, earnest and visibly unsettled. "Morning, Miss Marple," he began, tipping his hat. "You've heard the news, I suppose. A dreadful thing. Inspector Harrington, gone just like that." Miss Marple inclined her head gravely. "Yes, I've heard, my dear. I always thought he was a man of strong constitution. One doesn't simply fall down in a meadow without reason, wouldn't you say?" He blinked at her phrasing, unsure whether she was making an observation or a question. "Dr. Hayworth says it looks like heart failure," he replied cautiously. "No wounds, no struggle, just gone." "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "Heart failure can be quite persuasive when one wishes to believe it." He frowned slightly. "You don't think—" She smiled faintly. "I think nothing, my dear Rogers. Only that life, and indeed death, rarely occur without context. You'll see for yourself when you've had a little more experience." The constable shifted awkwardly, then touched his hat again and departed, clearly uncertain whether he'd been complimented or instructed. Miss Marple watched him go before turning toward her garden path, her thoughts turning to the night before. She remembered the faint exchange beneath the lilac bush, the glint of metal in Harrington's hand, the tension in Mrs. Denham's face, the way he'd looked relieved afterward. Something had passed between them, now that one of them was dead. By noon, the village had collectively agreed upon 3 possibilities. The first, voiced by Mrs. Price Ridley, was that Harrington had died of remorse. "They say he once sent an innocent man to prison years ago in Gloucester," she confided dramatically to anyone who would listen. The second, more charitable theory from Mrs. Clement was that he had simply overexerted himself walking home. The third, whispered by the grocer's wife, was that he'd been meeting Mrs. Denham for reasons of a delicate nature. Miss Marple, meanwhile, had taken her knitting and walked to the vicarage to offer condolences. She was received warmly, as she always was, though the vicar's wife looked rather flustered. "It's such a shock, Miss Marple. He was here one moment, gone the next. Poor man, and to think he'd just spoken so kindly of everyone." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. Kind words do tend to make people comfortable, sometimes even those who least deserve them. Before Mrs. Clement could ask what she meant, the doorbell rang. A tall man entered, greying at the temples, well-dressed but plainly not a villager. His coat still bore traces of travel. Chief Inspector Mallory, Mrs. Clement announced with evident relief. From county headquarters. Mallory greeted her politely, then turned to Miss Marple with the faint smile of a man used to introductions. Miss Jane Marple, I presume. I've read a few of your observations in old case reports. Sharp eyes for a lady of the parish. Miss Marple chuckled softly. One does what one can, Inspector. We all notice patterns, though most are kind enough to ignore them. Mallory's smile faded a touch. He was a man who preferred his patterns to come from evidence, not intuition. Well, he said briskly, Dr. Hayworth is fairly certain it was heart failure, but there are inconsistencies. His watch was stopped, perhaps broken during a fall, though there's no sign of struggle. And his wallet's missing. Robbery, perhaps, though it seems unlikely in a place like this. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Yes, unlikely but convenient, wouldn't you say? A theft gives shape to chaos. People find comfort in simple motives. He looked at her curiously, unsure how seriously to take the comment, then excused himself to speak to Mrs. Clement. When he was gone, Miss Marple stood for a long while by the vicarage window, gazing across the garden where the lilac bushes grew. The earth beneath them had been disturbed, trampled perhaps, and one of the blossoms had broken off, lying bruised on the grass. The same lilac she'd seen under moonlight, moments before Inspector Harrington had disappeared from the world. She bent down and examined it closely, her eyes narrowing. A faint shimmer on the stem caught the sunlight, a trace of something metallic, a thin residue that gleamed like dusted silver. She rubbed it gently between her fingers and frowned. Not dirt, not pollen, something sharper. A carriage rumbled past on the lane, breaking her thought. She straightened, smoothing her skirt, her expression unreadable. Across the hedge, two women paused their conversation to look her way, whispering behind gloved hands. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, as if she hadn't noticed, but her mind had already moved on. A man dead without struggle, a missing wallet, a stopped watch, a secret exchange beneath the lilac bush, and a faint metallic dust on a broken flower. It was, she thought, a rather odd collection of coincidences for a heart attack. That evening, as the lamps flickered in the cottages and a cool wind stirred the curtains, Miss Marple sat by her fireside and wrote a short note. Her handwriting was neat and steady. She addressed it to Chief Inspector Mallory, folded it carefully, and slipped it into an envelope. On the paper, she had written only one sentence. Before you accept the doctor's verdict, ask Mrs. Denham where she was at 11:42 and what she did with the inspector's pocket watch. Then, setting down her pen, she returned to her knitting, her face calm, but her thoughts far from still. The next morning broke damp and colourless, as though the village itself had lost its brightness overnight. Mist clung low over the meadow where the inspector had been found, and the sound of boots in wet grass echoed faintly as the constables continued their search for anything that might explain the mystery. But it was Miss Marple's note that had set things in motion. Chief Inspector Mallory arrived at Mrs. Denham's cottage shortly after breakfast. The curtains were still drawn, though a faint light burned in the sitting room. She received him with a practiced calm, her hair neatly arranged, her manner polite but cautious. I must say, she murmured, I find this all rather dreadful. The poor man deserved peace, not suspicion. Mallory inclined his head. I'm only trying to clear up a few small inconsistencies, Mrs. Denham. You were among the last to see him alive, I believe. Her eyes didn't waver, though her hand trembled slightly as she poured the tea. Yes, at the vicarage. I left before 11. He was speaking with Miss Marple when I said good night. Did you happen to walk home through the meadow?" "Certainly not," she replied quickly. Perhaps too quickly. "It was late. I took the lane by the post office." Mallory made a note, then added casually, "His pocket watch is missing. A rather distinctive silver one, engraved. Did you ever see him wear it?" Mrs. Denham hesitated for half a heartbeat before answering. Yes, I believe he had it last night. He showed it to someone, I think, near the end of the evening." "To you, perhaps?" Her smile flickered. "To me? Oh no, I can't recall such a thing." Mallory thanked her and left without pressing further, but as he stepped out into the lane, he saw Miss Marple standing a little way off, trimming a climbing rose along her garden wall. She greeted him with her usual mildness. "Ah, Inspector, a pity about the weather, though I suppose it keeps people from wandering too near the meadow." He gave a short nod. "You were quite right about Mrs. Denham. There's something in her manner, too deliberate perhaps." Miss Marple snipped a stem and smiled. "Guilt doesn't always manifest as fear, you know. Sometimes it appears as composure, rather like a curtain drawn too tightly over a window." Mallory studied her. "You seem to know the psychology of the thing better than most." "Oh, not psychology, my dear. Merely observation. People are much the same everywhere, whether in villages or cities. They think their secrets are unique, but they behave just like others who've had the same kind." He found himself strangely intrigued. "Then tell me, Miss Marple, what do you make of the residue found near the lilac bush? We've sent it for analysis, but the doctor thinks it's nothing, dust or sap, perhaps." She paused thoughtfully, looking down at the flower clippings in her hand. "I shouldn't think so. Sap has a certain dullness, don't you find? Whereas this had a glint, almost metallic, a sign of manufacture. I should be most curious to know whether Mr. Harrington owned a firearm, or if Mrs. Denham's late husband did." Mallory frowned. "Why would that matter?" "Because," Miss Marple said softly, "a heart can fail from fright just as easily as from poison. And fear, my dear Inspector, is often provoked by something quite tangible, such as a pistol." The thought lingered in his mind long after he left her. That evening, a constable reported finding the inspector's missing wallet half buried near the meadow fence, still containing his identification, but no money. The pocket watch, however, remained missing. By now, gossip had woven its own tangled net. Some claimed Mrs. Denham had quarreled with the inspector that night. Others swore she'd been expecting him. There were whispers, too, that her late husband's death, once thought to be a hunting accident, might not have been so innocent. Miss Marple, listening quietly as she purchased her afternoon bread, noted the tone of the talk. Rumors, she knew, had a way of surfacing truths that polite conversation buried. Later that afternoon, she received an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Denham herself stood at the gate, pale beneath her hat. "Miss Marple, may I come in?" "Of course, my dear," Miss Marple said warmly, leading her inside. "Do sit by the fire. It's a chill day for June." Mrs. Denham's eyes darted about the little sitting room, filled with books, lace, and the faint smell of lavender polish. "They're saying dreadful things about me," she began, her voice trembling. "I can't go to the post office without someone whispering. I had nothing to do with his death, you must believe that." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Belief is a curious thing, Mrs. Denham. It's rarely requested by the innocent, only by those who fear disbelief." The woman's face tightened. "You think I'm lying?" "Not at all. I think you're frightened. And fear often hides a truth that might, if spoken plainly, look far less damning." For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. Then Mrs. Denham whispered, "He was supposed to come to my house last night, to give me something, a letter, I think. He said it concerned my husband, but when I saw him at the vicarage, he looked nervous, agitated. I told him not to come. He insisted he would, and then, well, you know the rest." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "And the letter?" "I never received it. Nor the watch? Mrs.? Denham hesitated again. No. Miss Marple looked at her for a long moment, her face unreadable, and then said gently, "Then, my dear, I think you may not realize what you have received." Mrs. Denham blinked in confusion, but Miss Marple only smiled faintly and rose to draw the curtains. Outside, the mist was thickening again, swallowing the path to the meadow. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "the dead leave their truths in places they never meant to." As Mrs. Denham departed, visibly shaken, Miss Marple watched her vanish into the fog. Then she turned back toward her small writing desk, where an unopened envelope lay waiting. It had arrived that morning, forwarded by the vicarage. The sender's name was written in a hand Miss Marple recognized instantly. Inspector Harrington's. She broke the seal carefully, her heart steady but her fingers slow. Inside was a single sheet of paper, bearing only a few words in the inspector's tidy script. "If anything happens to me, look beneath the lilac bush." Miss Marple sat very still, the fog pressing softly against the window pane, and whispered to herself, "So you did see it coming, didn't you?" Miss Marple sat with the letter for a long while, her teacup cooling beside her. The inspector's handwriting was unmistakable, small, disciplined strokes of a man who valued precision. "If anything happens to me, look beneath the lilac bush." The words were clear, unambiguous, and yet they carried the quiet desperation of a man who had foreseen his own end. Outside, the mist thickened into a soft drizzle that muffled every sound in the village. Even the distant clatter of a milk cart seemed to fade into a hush. Miss Marple rose at last, folded the letter neatly back into its envelope, and wrapped her shawl around her shoulders. She did not hurry. She never did. But her steps were purposeful as she made her way down the narrow lane toward the vicarage garden. Chief Inspector Mallory was already there, conferring with a constable near the lilac bush. The ground had been cordoned off, though the flowers above it still bloomed innocently, their scent carrying faintly in the damp air. "Ah, Miss Marple," Mallory said, turning toward her with surprise. "I was about to call on you. I've just received the results from the residue analysis. It's mercury, or a derivative of it. Likely from a compound used to polish silver. Odd, isn't it?" "Not odd at all," Miss Marple replied mildly. "It's a fitting clue for a man whose final hour was marked by a stopped watch." Mallory frowned, uncomprehending, as she handed him the envelope. "From Inspector Harrington," she said softly. "Delivered this morning. I suggest, dear Inspector, you take his advice and look beneath the lilac bush." He stared at her, then at the letter, and signaled to the constable. The young man knelt, digging carefully where the soil appeared most recently disturbed. The damp earth yielded, slowly, but after a moment the blade struck something solid. Mallory bent down, brushing away the dirt himself, and a gleam of metal emerged, tarnished but unmistakable. It was a small box, no larger than a book, sealed tight with wax. Mallory broke it open and drew out its contents, a folded note, a small silver key, and a single sheet of stationery bearing a name. He read it once, then again, his expression darkening. "Good Lord," he breathed, It's an admission." Miss Marple tilted her head. "An admission of guilt or of knowledge?" Mallory handed her the paper. It was written in Harrington's firm hand, but the message was grimly concise. "Evidence enclosed regarding the Denham case, 1929. The verdict was wrong. He was innocent. I was deceived. If anything should happen to me, the truth lies in the safe deposit box. The key is enclosed." Miss Marple looked at the silver key, gleaming dully in Mallory's palm. "So," she murmured, "the past has finally demanded its payment." Mallory's voice was low, uneasy. "Denham's husband was convicted on Harrington's testimony, wasn't he? Killed himself in prison. The case was never questioned." "Until now," Miss Marple said quietly. "And I imagine Mrs. Denham has been waiting a very long time for this moment." Mallory straightened, troubled. You think she killed him then? Revenge? Revenge rarely wears so plain a face, Miss Marple replied. If she wanted him dead, she might have chosen a simpler method, but if she wanted him to suffer, if she wanted him to face what he'd done, then she'd have confronted him. Perhaps last night, beneath this very lilac bush. Mallory rubbed his chin. And the watch? A gift, Miss Marple said softly. Or perhaps a weapon. You see, mercury compounds, when handled in small amounts, can disrupt the heart if absorbed through the skin. A subtle thing, easily overlooked. I should imagine Mr. Harrington's watch chain was polished rather too recently. Mallory stared at her. You think she poisoned him with polish? Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. Oh, not polish, dear Inspector. Remorse. The kind that comes dressed in practicality, but let us not be too sure. One must confirm before one concludes. She turned toward the bush once more, bending slightly to examine the ground. Something caught her eye. A faint thread of green silk snagged on a branch near the base. She plucked it gently free and held it up. A torn seam, she said. And Mrs. Denham was wearing green last evening, was she not? Mallory took the thread from her gloved hand, exhaling slowly. I'll have her brought in. Do, said Miss Marple. But kindly, Inspector. I dare say she has lived many years under a heavier sentence than any court could pronounce. When they reached the Denham cottage an hour later, Mrs. Denham was seated by the fire, staring into the embers. She didn't look startled when they entered, only tired, the kind of weariness that sinks into the bones. Mallory laid the letter and key upon the table. Mrs. Denham, he said, his tone formal, Inspector Harrington's death was not of natural cause. We believe you know something about it. She looked at the key, her face paling. He told me he would write, she whispered. I didn't believe he actually had. I thought he'd... She broke off, her voice trembling. Miss Marple's tone was gentle. My dear, did you polish his watch before he left the vicarage? Mrs. Denham turned sharply toward her, eyes wide. No, he gave it to me once, years ago, when he retired my husband's case files. I kept it hidden all this time. Last night I returned it to him. I thought it would make him remember. Remember what? Mallory pressed. That a man died for nothing, she whispered. That I lost everything because of his mistake. I wanted him to live with it, not die from it. The silence that followed was heavy. Rain pattered faintly against the windows. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice low but certain. Then it seems, my dear, that remorse took its toll on both of you. Only his heart failed to bear it. Mallory studied Mrs. Denham for a long moment, then looked toward Miss Marple. You believe her? Yes, she said simply, because true hatred shouts. But guilt whispers. Outside, the rain had softened into a mist again. Miss Marple stood at the window, watching the lilacs sway gently in the wind. The flowers looked innocent once more, yet beneath them lay the proof that truth, like spring, eventually forces its way through the soil, no matter how long winter tries to hide it. And somewhere beyond the mist, the church bell began to toll, slow and deliberate, as if marking the closing of a chapter, not just of a man's life, but of a sin long buried beneath the lilacs of St. Mary Mead. For a time, the only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of the clock on Mrs. Denham's mantelpiece. It seemed oddly symbolic, the steady rhythm of time continuing after a man whose own watch had stopped forever. Chief Inspector Mallory stood by the hearth, studying the faint reflection of the flames in the silver key he still held. Miss Marple, seated opposite Mrs. Denham, regarded her with that same gentle patience she reserved for frightened children and guilty souls alike. You returned the watch to him, Miss Marple said softly, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. Not as a gift, but as a reminder, a symbolic gesture, perhaps, to make him face what he'd taken from you. Mrs. Denham nodded. her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I never wished him harm. Truly I didn't. I only wanted him to admit it, to say my husband wasn't a murderer. Harrington always said the evidence was certain, but he knew the witnesses lied." Her voice cracked. "He told me once, long ago, that justice sometimes demands silence. I believed him. Foolishly, I thought that made him noble." Mallory shifted uncomfortably. "And last night?" She hesitated, searching for words that wouldn't betray her. "He came to me after the gathering. He said he'd written everything down, a confession, proof, something to set it right. I told him I didn't want his pity or his apologies. Then he said he'd already sent the papers somewhere safe in case anything happened to him. That frightened me." "Why should it frighten you, my dear?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Because he looked—" She stopped and pressed a hand to her temple, as though remembering caused her pain. "He looked relieved, as though he'd done something final." Mallory frowned. "Final?" Mrs. Denham met his eyes. "Yes," he said, "it'll be over soon, Margaret. All of it." Then he left. That was the last I saw of him. The words hung between them, heavy and ambiguous. Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the rain-soaked window. "It's quite possible," she murmured, "that the inspector did not meet his end by another's hand at all, but by his own design." Mallory turned sharply. "You think he—" "I think," she said, her voice calm but certain, "that he may have sought a form of punishment. The residue beneath the lilac bush, mercury, as you said, can serve two purposes: to polish silver or to hasten death, if one has the will and the knowledge. And a man who carried guilt for years might choose to die in a way that appeared accidental, sparing the village scandal and sparing Mrs. Denham's suspicion." Mallory's jaw tightened. "That's conjecture." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said with a faint smile. "But conjecture, Inspector, is often the path to truth, provided one listens carefully enough." He didn't answer immediately. His eyes lingered on Mrs. Denham, who sat still as stone, her fingers twisting the edge of her handkerchief. "If he meant to take his own life," Mallory said at last, "why send that letter to you, Miss Marple? Why ask you to look beneath the lilac bush?" "Because he knew I would find what others might overlook," she replied simply. "He wanted his confession discovered, but not by the police, by someone who would understand what it meant." Mallory gave a quiet sigh. "It's an odd kind of justice." "Justice often is," Miss Marple said, "especially when it arrives late." He turned the silver key over in his hand again, then this deposit box. "It may contain everything we need to close the case properly." "Or to open it again," Miss Marple murmured. "I imagine whatever's inside will tell us more about the death of Mr. Denham than of Inspector Harrington. The two stories, you see, are not separate threads. They're woven together." Mallory nodded, though uneasily. "I'll send for a warrant at once." Miss Marple rose and adjusted her shawl. "Do allow me to accompany you when you visit the bank, Inspector. Old eyes see things that young ones sometimes overlook." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "I'd be a fool to refuse." That afternoon, the drizzle cleared enough to let in a pale light that made the pavements glisten. The small bank at the end of the high street was nearly empty when they arrived. The manager, a nervous man with a polished forehead, led them to a quiet office and produced the deposit box. Inside were a few faded documents, a folded photograph, and a small envelope labeled in Harrington's tidy hand, "For Margaret Denham." Mallory began reading the documents in silence, his expression hardening as he went. They were statements, affidavits, and a signed confession from one of the original witnesses in the 1929 case. A confession that exonerated Henry Denham entirely. The false testimony, it seemed, had been coerced by a local businessman seeking to hide his own wrongdoing. Harrington had learned of it years later, but kept silent to preserve his reputation. When he finished, he looked at Miss Marple. "So he really did destroy an innocent man's life?" She nodded, "and lived with it ever since. It explains his agitation. and his need to set the record straight, even if it cost him his life. Mallory handed her the small envelope marked for Margaret Denham. "You should give this to her," he said quietly. Miss Marple opened it carefully, revealing a single handwritten note. "I was wrong. Forgive me if you can. Tell no one. Let the truth speak for itself. H." She closed it slowly, her eyes reflecting a sadness that wasn't quite surprise. "He sought peace," she said, "but peace earned too late can still feel like punishment." When they left the bank, the sun had broken weakly through the clouds, laying pale gold across the roofs of St. Mary Mead. The village looked unchanged, the same cobbled lanes, the same murmuring hedges. But Miss Marple knew that beneath its surface, a small shift had occurred. A truth had been restored, and yet the balance of it felt as fragile as glass. As they parted at the corner, Mallory looked back at her. "You were right from the start. It wasn't murder. It was a reckoning." Miss Marple gave a faint, knowing smile. "Yes, Inspector. And reckoning, as I've often observed, tends to arrive on time, even when the clock has stopped." She turned then, walking slowly toward home, the letter still folded in her hand, the lilac blossoms swaying gently behind her, their fragrance heavy, sweet, and impossibly sad. The following morning dawned with the kind of deceptive calm that often follows unrest. A light mist clung to the rooftops, and the air carried the scent of lilac again. Faint, as though the earth itself were sighing out the last secret it had held. Miss Marple stood by her window, her tea growing cold, her thoughts lingering not on the inspector's death but on the silences that remained. Something, she felt, had not yet settled. Truth, once disturbed, seldom did so neatly. Her housekeeper, Florence, appeared in the doorway with a hesitant air. "Beg pardon, ma'am, but there's a young man to see you. Says he's come about the inspector." Miss Marple turned. "About Inspector Harrington?" "Yes, ma'am. Says his name's Robert Denham." The name drew a faint line between her brows. "Denham," she repeated softly, as if tasting the memory. "Show him in, Florence." The young man who entered could not have been more than 30. His clothes were neat but worn, his expression guarded, though his eyes, sharp and restless, held an uneasy resemblance to the photograph Miss Marple had seen in the bank's envelope the day before. "I suppose you know who I am," he began without preamble. "My father was Henry Denham." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "I did suspect as much. You resemble him, though you carry less anger in your eyes than he must have." "I've read the papers," Robert said. "Inspector Mallory gave me the letter you found. I came because my mother won't speak to me about any of it. She's locked herself away since yesterday." He paused, struggling to keep his composure. "But I can't rest until I know the truth. Did Harrington kill himself?" Miss Marple looked at him with quiet sympathy. "That's rather a heavy word for what may have been an act of conscience, my dear. But yes, I believe he arranged his own end, though not perhaps in the way he imagined it would unfold. Guilt is a dangerous thing when left unattended. It grows roots." He nodded, jaw tight. "Then what about my father? Will they reopen his case?" "That will depend on the authorities," she replied. "But the evidence is now clear. His name will be cleared, though far too late for him to know it." Robert exhaled, and for a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Then he said, "There's something else. When I was sorting through Mother's things this morning, I found this." He drew a small cloth pouch from his coat and placed it on the table. Inside was a silver watch, polished to a dull gleam, its chain neatly coiled. Miss Marple's eyes softened. "The inspector's watch?" Robert nodded. "She said he gave it to her years ago, but she'd never shown it to me. I opened the back. There's an engraving. Not his initials, though. Just 2 words. Time forgives." Miss Marple turned the watch over in her hand, her thumb brushing the faint letters. "How curious," she murmured. "Forgiveness, you see, isn't truly about the passage of time. It's about what one chooses to remember." Robert looked toward the window where the mist was lifting, revealing the spire of the church. "She loved my father," he said quietly. "Even after everything, she never left this place. I think she stayed because she wanted him to be remembered, even if no one spoke his name aloud." Miss Marple nodded. "Grief has a way of becoming habit. One forgets how to live without it." She placed the watch back into his hands. "Keep it, Mr. Denham. It belongs to both men now, the one who sought forgiveness and the one who never received it." He hesitated. "And my mother?" "She will need time," Miss Marple said gently. "You cannot mend a wound that has defined a life in a single day, but kindness often does what justice cannot." He left soon after, the mist following him down the lane. Miss Marple stood for a while, watching him disappear into the turning light, her thoughts weaving together the final threads. The inspector's death, the confession, the lilac bush. All of it had formed a pattern that was not about crime, but about conscience. Yet there was still something unresolved in her heart, a sense that the story had not truly closed. Later that afternoon, Chief Inspector Mallory stopped by her cottage, his face lined with fatigue. "We've concluded the matter officially," he said after she poured his tea. "The cause of death recorded as cardiac arrest, precipitated by mercury exposure. The papers will call it an accident. It's cleaner that way." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The truth rarely is." He studied her a moment. "Do you think Harrington would have wanted people to know the whole of it?" "I think," she said softly, "he wanted only one person to know, and to forgive him. Whether she ever will is another question entirely." Mallory nodded slowly, then looked toward the garden. "Funny thing, the lilacs blooming brighter than ever, even after all the disturbance." Miss Marple followed his gaze, her expression unreadable. "Yes, some things thrive on being unearthed." When he had gone, she sat by the window again, the silver watch ticking faintly beside her cup. Outside, children laughed faintly in the distance, the sound of a village returning to itself. And as the last of the light faded over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple closed her eyes, her thoughts drifting between memory and silence. In time, the scandal would fade, as all village scandals did. But every spring, when the lilacs bloomed and their scent carried softly through her open window, she would remember the man whose heart had failed. Not from poison, but from the unbearable weight of finally telling the truth. Evening settled over St. Mary Mead like a veil. The clouds had thinned, revealing streaks of fading gold across the sky, and a hush had descended over the lanes, broken only by the low hum of cicadas and the occasional bark of a distant dog. Miss Marple sat by her hearth, her knitting resting forgotten in her lap. The silver watch gleamed faintly on the table beside her, ticking with an almost human insistence, as though determined to remind her that time, for all its supposed mercy, never truly stopped moving. She had intended to put the matter to rest, as Chief Inspector Mallory had. Yet something in her mind resisted closure. It wasn't guilt nor curiosity. Not exactly. It was the subtle sense, that instinctive unease she'd long ago learned to trust, that one small thread in the tapestry remained untied. Her thoughts turned again to Robert Denham, the way his hands had trembled when he'd handed her the pouch, the uncertain look in his eyes when he'd mentioned his mother's silence. It was more than grief. There had been fear there too. Fear mixed with duty, the kind of expression one wears when keeping another's secret. The clock struck 7, and Florence appeared at the doorway. "Excuse me, ma'am, but there's someone at the gate again. Same young man from this morning." Miss Marple looked up slowly. "Robert?" "Yes, ma'am. Looks a bit pale, if I may say so." "Show him in, please." When Robert entered, he seemed changed, exhausted, drawn, his collar damp with rain and his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. He stood just inside the doorway, as though uncertain whether he ought to have come. "I'm sorry to trouble you again, Miss Marple," he began, "but I can't speak to anyone else, not the inspector, not even my mother." Miss Marple motioned to the chair opposite. "You're not troubling me in the least, my dear. Sit. You look as though you've been walking the lanes for hours." He obeyed, sinking into the chair. "I can't rest. Something's wrong. I thought once the truth about my father came out, we'd finally have peace. But now, I'm not sure what we've uncovered at all." Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, watching him. "Go on." "She's hiding something," he said in a low voice. "I don't mean out of guilt. It's worse than that. I think she knows something about Harrington's death that she hasn't told anyone." Miss Marple's expression remained gentle, though her mind sharpened like a blade. "Why do you believe that?" "This evening," Robert continued, "I heard her talking in her room. At first I thought she was praying, but she was speaking to someone. She said, 'He found it, Henry. He found the letter.' Then I heard her crying." Miss Marple was silent for a long moment. "And you're certain she said, 'Henry'?" "Yes." His voice trembled slightly. "My father's name. But he's been dead 15 years. Miss Marple rose and moved toward the window, drawing the curtain aside slightly. Outside, the street lay dark, save for the faint orange glow of a gas lamp by the corner. "People who have lived long with sorrow," she said softly, "often speak to the dead. But what troubles me, Mr. Denham, is not that your mother spoke to her late husband, but that she mentioned a letter." Robert leaned forward. "You think there's another one?" "I think," Miss Marple said, turning back to him, "that there may have been a letter between them long before the one Harrington wrote at the end. Something he feared might resurface. Something your mother has kept hidden." He ran a hand through his hair. "Then what do we do?" "Do nothing rash," Miss Marple replied gently. "Go home. Stay with her. Say nothing of what you've told me. Sometimes when truth is buried too deep, it must be coaxed out rather than dug up." He hesitated, wanting to ask more, but her calmness steadied him. He nodded and left quietly, closing the door behind him. Miss Marple remained by the hearth, the silver watch ticking beside her. She poured herself a fresh cup of tea and sat thinking. A letter, hidden, or perhaps never delivered. A piece of the past, still exerting its shadow. She thought of the lilac bush again, of how Inspector Harrington had chosen that very place, perhaps because he knew something had once been buried there before. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, as the hours crept past midnight, she sat listening to the faint ticking of the watch and the soft patter of rain returning to the eaves. At 1:30, a knock came at the door. Florence called from her room, startled, but Miss Marple was already on her feet. She opened the door without fear. On the step stood Chief Inspector Mallory, coat drenched, expression grim. "Forgive me, Miss Marple," he said quietly. "I wouldn't have disturbed you at this hour if it weren't serious. There's been another incident." Her voice was steady, though her heart tightened. "Who?" "Mrs. Denham," he said. "Found in her sitting room, not dead, not yet, thank God, but barely conscious. Dr. Hayworth suspects poison." For the briefest instant, Miss Marple closed her eyes. The inevitability of it hit her like a familiar ache. "And the boy?" she asked. "He's the one who called for help," Mallory said. "Said he found her collapsed beside the fire. There was an envelope in her hand addressed to you." Miss Marple reached for her shawl. "Then I think, Inspector," she said quietly, "it's time we stopped letting the dead speak for the living, before the living join them." Together, they stepped out into the rain. The lilacs shimmered faintly in the lamplight as they passed, their fragrance sharper now, almost metallic, as though the earth itself knew that one final secret was waiting to rise from beneath its roots. The Denham cottage was silent, except for the rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the low murmur of the doctor's voice. Miss Marple and Chief Inspector Mallory stepped inside, their shoes leaving faint impressions on the damp stone floor. The air smelled faintly of burnt wood and something more acrid. A trace of medicine, perhaps, or poison disguised as such. In the sitting room, Mrs. Denham lay on the sofa, her face pale and drawn, her breathing shallow but steady under the doctor's care. A small glass sat overturned on the rug beside her, the liquid inside absorbed into the fibers. The fire had burned low, throwing long, flickering shadows against the walls. Robert stood near the window, staring out into the darkness, his hands clenched tight around a handkerchief. "She'll live," Dr. Hayworth said finally, looking up as Miss Marple entered. It was laudanum, but not enough to be fatal. Perhaps deliberate, perhaps a mistake. She'll need rest and quiet. Miss Marple nodded, her gaze moving to the envelope still clutched in the doctor's hand. "Was that found with her?" Mallory answered, his voice subdued. "Yes, it's addressed to you." He handed it over, and Miss Marple turned it delicately in her fingers. The paper was damp along one edge, as if it had been held too long in a trembling hand. She broke the seal and unfolded the single page inside. The handwriting was shaky, uneven, the letters trailing as though written in haste. "Miss Marple." There are things I cannot say aloud. The inspector was not the only one who kept a secret. My husband, he did not die by his own hand. I have lived with that truth for 15 years. Tell Robert I am sorry. MD Miss Marple lowered the paper slowly, her expression unreadable. "So," she murmured, half to herself, the final thread at last. Mallory leaned closer. "Are you saying Henry Denham was murdered?" Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward Robert, who still stood rigid by the window, his back turned to them. "I'm saying," she said softly, "that truth, when buried for too long, changes shape. What Mrs. Denham carried was not guilt for her husband's death, but for concealing how it truly came about." Robert turned sharply. "You mean she lied all these years? About him, about everything?" "She lied to survive," Miss Marple said gently, "and perhaps to protect someone." Mallory frowned. Protect whom, if she wasn't shielding herself? Miss Marple's gaze moved to the hearth. "Inspector Harrington once said justice demands silence. I think Mrs. Denham believed that too. She may have taken responsibility for something that wasn't hers to bear." Mallory followed her eyes toward the fire, where faint smudges marked the bricks, as though something had been recently burned. He crouched, brushing aside a bit of ash, and pulled free the charred edge of a photograph. Only a fragment remained, a man's hand resting on a watch chain. Miss Marple's breath caught, barely audible. "The same chain," she whispered. Mallory looked up. "You mean the inspector's?" "Or Henry Denham's," she said softly. "It appears they were identical, and I dare say one was exchanged for the other long ago, perhaps on a night when vengeance and justice looked very much alike." Robert turned from the window, his face pale. "You think my father and Harrington—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that the inspector may have played a greater role in your father's death than even Mrs. Denham knew. Perhaps she discovered it later, in some confession, or through a clue only she recognized. It would explain why she kept silent. Her life since then has been penance." Mallory stood, the fragment of photograph turning to soot in his hand. Then Harrington's suicide wasn't just guilt over a wrongful conviction, it was guilt over a death he caused, or at least one he allowed to happen. "Quite possibly," Miss Marple said. "A man can live with error, but not with cowardice. When truth began to stir again, with his retirement, his farewell, he must have realized he could no longer keep it buried." The doctor gathered his things and nodded toward Mrs. Denham. "She'll wake soon. I'd keep the questioning gentle if I were you." Miss Marple inclined her head, There will be no questioning tonight, only waiting. The men left quietly, and Miss Marple remained by the faintly glowing hearth, the letter open on her lap. The house was utterly still now, save for the fragile rhythm of breath from the sofa. In the corner, the silver watch on the mantel ticked faintly, out of sync with the clock above it, as though marking a separate time altogether. Miss Marple rose, walking slowly to the window. The rain had stopped, and the moon had broken free of the clouds, casting pale light over the garden. The lilac bush stood motionless in the yard, its blossoms heavy and gleaming with dew. She watched it for a long while, then turned back toward the room, her voice barely more than a whisper. "No one ever truly buries the past," she said. "It waits, like spring beneath the frost." And as she folded the letter carefully into her pocket, Mrs. Denham stirred faintly in her sleep. A small sound, almost a sigh, as if some long-kept secret had finally begun to loosen its hold. By morning, the sky had cleared, though the air still carried the heaviness of rain. Sunlight fell through the lace curtains of the Denham cottage, pale and uncertain, as if reluctant to touch the walls that had absorbed too much sorrow. Miss Marple sat quietly beside Mrs. Denham's bed, her hands folded neatly in her lap. The faint ticking of the watch on the nightstand mingled with the soft wheeze of the invalid's breath. Mrs. Denham stirred, her eyelids fluttering open. For a moment, her gaze wandered the room in confusion, then settled on Miss Marple's face. There was no surprise there, only resignation. As if she had expected this meeting all along. "You should have let me go," she whispered, her voice dry as paper. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone calm and compassionate. "I could not do that, my dear. The truth rarely ends with one death. It only changes the kind of pain left behind." A faint smile trembled at the corner of Mrs. Denham's lips. "You sound like him," she murmured. "Like my Henry." "Then perhaps," Miss Marple said softly, "you owe him one more truth before you rest." The woman turned her face toward the window, where the morning light touched the edge of the lilac bush beyond the glass. For a long moment she said nothing, and Miss Marple did not press her. Silence, she had learned, was often the only invitation needed. When Mrs. Denham finally spoke, her voice was scarcely audible. "It wasn't the inspector who killed my husband." "Not directly." "Henry. He went to Harrington that night to beg for another hearing, another chance to prove he was innocent. They argued. I was there, outside the door, listening. I heard Harrington tell him it was over, that no one would believe him. Henry struck him, and Harrington pushed back. He fell, hit his head against the desk. I heard the sound. He didn't die at once. I ran in, but Henry was gone, out into the night. Harrington was breathing, but barely. He looked at me and said, 'Say it was an accident. Don't let him hang for it.'" She closed her eyes, the memory pulling her voice down to a whisper. "So I did. I said my husband took his own life. I burned the letter Henry had left, the one he wrote for me that night. It said he couldn't bear to live dishonored. I thought I was saving him, but Harrington never told anyone the truth. He let the case stand as it was. He kept my secret and his guilt both." Miss Marple listened without moving, her gaze fixed on the window where the light was growing stronger. The village beyond was waking. A milk cart creaking down the lane, a child's laughter somewhere distant. Ordinary sounds of life continuing, indifferent to the tragedies it surrounded. "And the poison last night?" she asked gently. Mrs. Denham's eyes opened again, unfocused. "I wanted to stop the voices. My husband's, the inspector's. Every spring when the lilacs bloomed, they came back. I could hear them in the garden, arguing again. I thought if I joined them, perhaps it would finally be quiet." Miss Marple reached forward, resting a light hand over hers. "It will be quiet soon enough, my dear. But it was never their forgiveness you needed, only your own." A tear slipped down Mrs. Denham's cheek, though her lips formed the faintest smile. "You sound so sure." One learns to be sure of small things, Miss Marple said. The rest one leaves to Providence. The door creaked open, and Robert entered quietly, carrying a small vase of lilacs. The scent filled the room, sweet, sharp, unmistakably alive. He froze at the sight of his mother awake, his face a mixture of fear and tenderness. She looked at him for a long time before speaking. "I kept too much from you," she said. "Too much for too long." He set the vase down and took her hand. "Then tell me now, Mother." But Miss Marple rose softly, collecting her shawl. "No," she said gently. "Not now. Some truths are meant only for two people to share, and no one else." She gave Robert a small nod, then turned toward the door. "I'll be just outside." As she stepped into the corridor, she felt the weight in the air begin to ease. The sound of quiet voices followed her, low, halting, but alive. Confession had a way of healing even what justice could not. Outside, the garden was drenched with light. The lilac bush swayed lightly in the breeze, droplets glittering on its blossoms like small, bright tears. Miss Marple paused beside it, her fingers brushing the petals. There was peace there now. Not complete, but beginning. The village would gossip, of course, and the police would file their reports, each drawing neat conclusions that made sense on paper. But Miss Marple knew that the truth, as always, was not tidy. It lingered in the spaces between guilt and mercy, between what one could prove and what one could never forget. As she walked back toward her cottage, the sound of the ticking watch echoed in her mind. Steady, patient, eternal. Some clocks stopped too soon, others carried on out of rhythm, but all, she thought, marked the same quiet lesson. Time forgives, perhaps, but only after it remembers. And that spring in St. Mary Mead, beneath the lilac bush that had witnessed both love and death, time had at last remembered everything. The following days passed with a strange, subdued stillness that seemed to settle over St. Mary Mead like mist. Word of the Denham revelations spread quietly, filtered through whispers and half-truths, reshaped by the village's tireless imagination. By the end of the week, every household had its version of the story. Some pitied Mrs. Denham, others condemned her, and a few claimed they had always suspected something was amiss. Miss Marple, as usual, did not correct anyone. She simply listened, for gossip, properly handled, often revealed more than inquiry ever could. She spent most of her time in her garden, pruning her roses and tending to the climbing ivy that wrapped around her gate. Yet beneath her calm routine, her thoughts lingered on the lingering details of the case, the inspector's deliberate choice of the lilac bush, the missing years between Henry Denham's death and Harrington's confession, and the faint traces of polished residue she'd seen beneath the soil. Guilt and remorse explained much, but not everything. There was one thing that continued to trouble her. The watch. Its engraving, "Time Forgives," seemed less a sentiment than a message. It had been gifted long before the inspector's death, but it carried a weight that felt almost prophetic. It was late afternoon when Chief Inspector Mallory stopped by her cottage once more. His coat was dusted with pollen, and his expression carried that reluctant look of a man whose official duties had been overtaken by quiet curiosity. "I've just come from the hospital," he said after Miss Marple had offered him tea. "Mrs. Denham is recovering, weak but lucid. She won't face charges. Dr. Hayworth and I agreed she's been punished enough." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Quite right. The law is very fond of paperwork, but conscience keeps a better record." Mallory smiled faintly. "You always find the poetic way to say what I can't put on a report." He reached into his pocket and placed the silver watch on the table between them. "I thought you might like to see this again. Robert found it when they cleared the house this morning. It stopped, same as before. But look." He pressed the small button at its side. The back panel clicked open. Beneath the inscription, "Time Forgives," A second, fainter line was etched almost invisibly into the metal. Miss Marple leaned closer, but only if you tell it the truth. She was silent for a long while, her eyes reflecting the glint of the inscription. "How very like him," she said at last. "He wanted absolution, but even in death he was afraid to name his sin aloud." Mallory nodded. "We may never know the whole of it. How much was accident? How much intent? Harrington's files were meticulous, but there's no note, no diary, nothing to explain why he chose to die when he did." "Oh, I wouldn't say that," Miss Marple murmured, tracing the rim of the watch with one delicate finger. "He left this, a clock that no longer tells time but still carries truth. Perhaps he meant it as a warning that forgiveness without confession is merely another kind of deceit." Mallory frowned slightly, absorbing her words. "Do you think Mrs. Denham will ever forgive him?" Miss Marple set the watch down, her gaze distant. "In her own way, yes. She already has. When one carries grief long enough, it turns into something quieter. Not forgiveness, exactly, but understanding. And that, my dear Inspector, is the only kind of peace worth finding." He said nothing for a moment, just watched the shadows shift across her parlor. The sound of the village drifted faintly through the open window, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the laughter of children chasing a hoop along the lane. It was as if life, having paused for tragedy, had quietly decided to resume. When he rose to leave, Mallory hesitated by the door. "It's a strange business, isn't it? Justice. Sometimes it feels less like a verdict and more like a garden, something that grows slowly and never quite evenly." Miss Marple smiled. "A garden needs tending, Inspector. Left alone, it becomes wild. And yet," she added, looking toward her roses in the fading light, "sometimes the wild parts are the truest." After he left, she sat for a while longer, the silver watch resting on the table beside her. The ticking had long ceased, but in the quiet of her cottage, she thought she could still hear it faintly. Not in the room, but somewhere just beneath the sound of the world itself. That evening, as twilight deepened over the village, Miss Marple walked once more to the Denham garden. The lilac bush shimmered under the moonlight, its scent heavy, almost sweet to the point of sorrow. She knelt by it, brushing the soil gently with her gloved hand. Beneath the roots, the earth was firm again, untroubled, as though it had decided to forget. But Miss Marple did not forget. She never did. She stood for a long moment, gazing at the quiet house where the windows glowed softly in the night. Inside, Robert sat with his mother, reading aloud by lamplight. The words were faint, but Miss Marple could almost hear them. A passage from a book about endurance, about forgiveness, about the small mercies that survive even the darkest years. She turned back toward the lane, the cool night air brushing her face. The church bell began to chime the hour, each note clear and deliberate, echoing through the stillness. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. Time, it seemed, had begun again. The next morning broke clear and gold, the kind of morning that makes even sorrow look softer. The village had resumed its rhythm. Milk pails clanging, sparrows chattering, and a distant church bell marking the hour with calm precision. Yet beneath that calm, something subtle had changed. A tension, once invisible but ever present, had quietly released its hold on St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple sat at her breakfast table, her newspaper folded neatly beside her cup. She had not yet read the headlines. The news would, of course, report the tragic but natural death of a retired inspector and the closure of a decades-old case. There would be mention of remorse, redemption, and human frailty. What there would not be, and what Miss Marple alone would understand, was the truth of what had really happened between Inspector Harrington and the Denhams all those years ago. A soft knock came at the door. Florence, ever the picture of composure, ushered in Chief Inspector Mallory. He looked lighter than before, though still thoughtful, as if a puzzle had finally assembled itself in his mind overnight. "I've just come from the Denhams," he said, setting his hat on the table. "Mrs. Denham is resting comfortably. Roberts decided to take her to her sister's in Devon once she's stronger." Miss Marple nodded, pleased. "A sea breeze will do her good. The past tends to weigh less when there's salt in the air." Mallory smiled faintly, but then reached into his coat pocket and drew out a small folded document. "Before they left, she gave me this. Said you should be the one to have it." Miss Marple unfolded the paper carefully. It was old, brittle at the edges, but preserved with care. Across the top was written, "The Statement of Henry Denham, May 1929. Her eyes skimmed the words. It was brief, written in a steady hand. "If this reaches Margaret, let her know that I forgive her silence." The inspector acted not from malice, but from fear. Fear that truth would ruin him. He was not my enemy, only a coward. I was both. "Tell her that when spring returns, she must plant lilac over the place where all this ends. Then, perhaps, we may rest." Miss Marple laid the paper down and looked up at Mallory. So it was her husband's wish, after all. Mallory nodded. Seems he knew what kind of man Harrington was. Maybe even understood him. It's strange, isn't it? After all that tragedy, all that pain, they each spent the rest of their lives trying to protect one another from the truth. "Ah," Miss Marple said softly. "But that's the way of human beings, Inspector. We do the wrong thing for the right reason, and then spend years trying to make it right again." He sighed, glancing out through the window toward her garden. "The file's closed now, officially. The records will be corrected. But the part that stays with me, I can't quite decide who was most guilty in the end." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes warm but knowing. "All of them, I should think. And yet none of them entirely. Justice isn't always a matter of law, you see. Sometimes it's a matter of endurance. To live with what you've done or failed to do can be punishment enough." Mallory nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You're right. You usually are." He gathered his hat and made for the door, but paused before leaving. "There's one thing I still can't quite get out of my head. That watch, time forgives. Do you think Harrington believed that?" Miss Marple looked down at the table, where the silver watch now rested beside Henry Denham's letter. Its surface caught the light, gleaming softly, the engraving still faintly visible. "No," she said at last, her tone calm but certain. "I think he hoped it might." When Mallory had gone, Miss Marple sat for a long while in the quiet. She reached for the watch and turned it in her hand, listening, though it no longer ticked, as if the silence between its cogs still held something alive. Then she rose, took her shawl, and stepped into the garden. The morning air was cool, touched with the scent of lilac. Dew still clung to the petals, and a small robin hopped along the stone path as if accompanying her. She knelt by the bush, its blossoms radiant in the sunlight, and carefully tucked the letter beneath its roots. One truth returned to the earth that had carried so many. For a moment, she simply remained there, her hands resting on the soil. Around her, the village carried on, the faint hum of a motor car, the laughter of children in the distance, the steady rhythm of life reclaiming its peace. Then she stood, brushed the soil from her gloves, and looked toward the horizon. The sun was rising fully now, golden light spilling over rooftops and hedgerows, chasing away the last traces of shadow. In that light, Miss Marple smiled. Not the smile of victory, nor even of satisfaction, but of quiet understanding. The case was finished, but not ended. Some stories never truly ended. They simply grew roots, like the lilacs, waiting for someone patient enough to listen when they bloomed again. And as she walked back toward her cottage, the breeze stirred the petals behind her, carrying their fragrance down the lane. a gentle, fleeting whisper of all that had been confessed, forgiven, and finally laid to rest.